Hello, everyone. This is Ed K. Smith, the co-host of the Asset Show, here with the other co-host, Mr. Rob Kay. Hey, Rob, how are you?
Good, mate.
Very good to see you, buddy. And we've got our special guest on the show today, Steve Vallas from Blockchain Australia. He is the CEO. He's a very, very busy man. He's got lots to share with us and update us on what's going on in the world of blockchain, both in Australia and globally, and get a bit of a backstory on Steve and how we got involved in this whole big new industry that's very exciting to lots of people and very confusing to many, many, many others. So welcome, Steve. Thanks for coming on the show, mate.
Thank you, and I appreciate the pump up. I might let some people down now, but I'm good to go.
Not a chance. I've been following you for a while, so I know you're good to go with that one for sure. So Rob has got some leading questions to get the ball rolling that he's got on his trusty whiteboard to his left, which contains all of his worldly secrets. So take it away, Rob.
Yeah, thanks again for coming on today, Steve. You're the CEO of Blockchain Australia, and we'll get into some other stuff you're involved in as well. But first, I think people always like to know how people got to where they are today. And I noticed from like 2008 to 2020, you were running a company called Honey, like Honey Digital, and you're also running Blockchain APAC and Blockchain 2020. Maybe you can briefly take us through what you were doing there.
Sure. There's a very logical path with the benefit of hindsight.
Yeah.
And as we all are geniuses, when you look back and you point to all the things that were incredibly good decisions, mine is a very odd work history, and it culminated in a lot of value, I think, in the role that I've had now for the last couple of years. Formerly qualified as a lawyer, so aware of what that hat is. That hat has never been more useful, notwithstanding the fact that I've long since forgotten what I learned when I was at university and didn't practice for a great length of time either, but that lens is important. So that carries through to this day. I did some hospitality stuff. So the reality of the hospitality was actually a property development, but I ran a hospitality business. That was a byproduct of the property development. That was customer experience, customer engagement, and sort of the recognition of what a sort of a high touch communication strategy looks like in a functional business. That morphed into digital strategy, because what happened oddly was I became the voice of the business, faceless, but the voice of the business through channels like Twitter and Facebook. And I embraced those channels in such a material way that I ended up doing that for work. So I quickly devolved from the hospitality person and much more into the person that was giving digital strategy advice. So Facebook and Twitter and early sort of social channels. That then led me to strategy in general. I found myself in a lot of businesses talking about what their product was, product market fit looked like, what their runway was, what their resources looked like. So accidentally became a management consultant of sorts, talking about digital strategy stuff. So all these things were sort of the development of skills across industry, across verticals. So when I got to that late stage of that consulting sort of life, it was property, financial services, sports, education. I just got into a lot of different rooms. Blockchain popped up on the radar for me probably 5 or 6 years ago, crypto and blockchain. And the thing I liked about it was super hard. It wasn't easy to navigate your way through. It also struck me as something that you would need to invest time over an extended period to understand well. So it allowed me to kind of shake loose a lot of people that talked about subject and domain experience they didn't otherwise have. Very hard in the management sort of sector and social to discern who knows what they're talking about, who doesn't. So I like the challenge that was, this is a moat in a sense, and I like the idea of sort of trying to cross that moat to understand the space. So I lived 2 lives for a period of time. One was I went to every single meetup that was going, literally hundreds of meetups over probably a 24-month period. I sat in those rooms more than anything else to understand who was who, much more than learning in the room. So it was the face-to-face interaction that gave me a sense of people's capabilities. And then I did my homework by night and the day job. I just kept doing the consulting job. And that, in an odd way, led me to Blockchain Australia. I ultimately built a very big network that lived outside of the peak body. And I was tapped on the shoulder and they said, hey, by the way, you seem to be doing this outside of this organization. Why wouldn't you not consider doing it within? And it felt like it was the right time. It wasn't the role I coveted, truth be told, but it felt like I could make an impact in a more formal setting. So I said yes, and that's been the last couple of years. So that's the fast-talking ex-lawyer, ex-hospo, management consultant, social guy into blockchain. Of course, logical path.
Yeah, oh, great. That's what we wanted. Yeah, because a lot of people watch the show and we introduce people that are running a company or are a head of a genre, and they wonder how the person got there. So it's good to summarize that.
And to satisfy the lawyer section of you, Steve, we have to do a disclaimer before we continue that please do your own research. This is not financial advice. Anything we say on this podcast is for educational purposes only. So seek professional advice on anything regarding crypto, blockchain, NFTs. These are just our opinions. So yes, that's out of the way. And it brings me to it's a basic question. And I always say to Rob, when we do these podcasts, we should not assume that people know what something is, because we've got all different types of viewers who are watching or listening to this. And there's a lot of confusion over what the blockchain is, because the term the blockchain, I think, is confusing in itself, because it's sort of like saying the internet. And a lot of people I talk to think the blockchain is just one thing. It's it is the internet, or it is the blockchain. So in the simplest format, how would you describe what is blockchain?
Sure. What I tend to do is bookend the conversations, because you're right, when the language is confusing, it's been conflated. People use it when they're referring to very, very different things. And then the challenge of the narrow definition is people say, well, that's not what my definition of blockchain is. So the bookends for me on the framing for people generally is at one end of the spectrum, what probably most people from a retail perspective and the newspaper's perspective is cryptocurrencies. This libertarian paradise where all the intermediaries are removed. We no longer need governments. It is Bitcoin-esque. It's a maxi kind of a view. That's where most people view it, and that's ultimately a data structure at its heart, very simple. But that's where people tend to have a lot of the attention focused is cryptocurrencies, and then the speculation that happens at one end. So that's what one end of the spectrum is. The other end of the spectrum, which is in many respects much more boring, but ultimately 95% of my conversation is blockchain when you're describing things like process improvement, distributed ledger technology, better spreadsheets ultimately. So it's kind of that's the world of industry. That's where government is looking in many respects. They're saying, this is something will have some impact on traditional financial services and infrastructure. So they're the bookends. One is business as usual, but a better mousetrap in many respects. And the other is the cryptocurrency side. They're very different ends of the spectrum. So when I chat to people and people take umbrage at either end, people at the DLT end say crypto is a waste of time, and people at the crypto end say, well, that's not even cryptocurrency, or it's not blockchain. So depending on where you are, they're kind of the bookends of where the conversations live.
Cool. Yeah. Yep. That describes it very accurately in my view too. And I have those same sort of conversations. And you won't believe this, but mainstream media tends to grab onto all the negative stuff. I know you haven't ever experienced that. I know, sensing the sarcasm in my voice here. Mainstream, as soon as there's anything bad that happens, which obviously there has been over the last 6 months, there's been all sorts of things go on. Mainstream media gets onto it. And of course, everyone's saying this whole space is dead. They're painting the whole sector under the umbrella of Web3 per se, as being done and dusted, and it's all over. I'm sure you've heard that from many people. What are your thoughts, and what do you say to people who think this whole sector is now dead?
People tend to simplify, oversimplify. That's the reality of this sector. That subject matter is something that's really important, and the thing that is a challenge, and luckily for me, I don't take it personally when I'm going in and out of rooms. When I hear the word everything is a scam, here's what I tend to try to separate out. This is sort of undoing what is conflated language. When I say scams, I think of what the word scam means. Scam is an attempt to defraud people. Scam does not mean I didn't make money. Scam is someone seeking to be defrauded. When we look at what the scams are in this space, they are the same things that we as an industry observe as scams. People who are creating email scams, text scams, phishing scams, romance scams, ransomware attacks, all those things are utilizing either language or a lack of education or some FOMO to take advantage of people. That is a scam, right? That is almost, that's probably 85% of when you read the headlines, when they talk about things, that's what they're referring to, but they don't tend to articulate that well. On the other side, you'd say, well, okay, let's talk about bad actors within the industry. Those actors are much more disparate than you would be led to believe by the other conversation. When we talk about sort of regulatory responses, and this is the case in, say, the United States as opposed to Australia, the regulators aren't going after that many people. So you go, we're talking about bad actors in the space. Those bad actors are not, don't have the prevalence that this scam challenge is. So it's like, let's separate it. Let's talk about what the industry is and actors within the industry that you're saying are not doing the right thing. And let's talk about scams. But let's not put them both together, because on that basis, it feels like they are part of the same thing. They're not. People are trying to defraud on one side, and then we're saying bad actors that are in the industry itself. So it's a challenge sort of having that conversation, because the regulators themselves struggle with it. The ACCC recently released a report on scams, and it spoke largely to that first part. It didn't say the industry is filled with scammers. It says people are taking advantage of a failure to grasp what this industry is, and they're clicking on links and doing the same thing that we suffer from every bank link that comes through on our phone. Don't answer the private number calls, don't click on your phone. It's that kind of scam. So that's a challenge for the industry, but it's also a challenge for participants that are traditional financial service providers and governments that try to educate people about the difference between the two.
Awesome. Superbly said.
And then, even though the mainstream media is saying like, you know, Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are losing a lot of their basically capital, I guess people working in the blockchain industry don't even care. They just keep building, right? Because so what if Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are going down? Like you said before, that's just a small section of the whole blockchain industry and blockchain technology.
Rob, I've got to tell you that point is not really clickable on a headline, right? I mean, the reality is, if I write the article that says everything's going okay, it won't make top 10 on news. It won't make the AFR thing.
If you put out a newsletter that says we're doing all this amazing stuff in blockchain, everyone thinks, hang on, I thought it's all dying. It's
the challenge here is the conversation. I heard someone yesterday say, if it bleeds, it leads. You know, is the traditional thing you've got to get.
Yeah,
to be a problem in order for people to click, and that won't change. And that's why when people say, I really wish there was a much more positive narrative. I've said, unless you watch the news sparingly, you'll recognize that what matters is this headline that is terrible, which I get, which I don't take sort of personally. What I can tell you outside of that, the two kind of views, one from an industry perspective and one from a government sort of perspective. The reasons why governments around the world are coming together to determine what they should or shouldn't do is because this technology works. It runs counter to narrative. Those that so to say, look, this is just a scam, it doesn't do anything. Well, that's easy. Easiest thing in the world to deal with by governments. Ban everything, make it a criminal activity, or have some sort of penalty that says you can't do this. It doesn't. That's not what they're doing. What they're trying to do is figure out how this integrates with payment systems, how it deals with process improvement. So it's very complicated. So that's why they're doing this. So that runs counter to it's all a scam and it doesn't work. I was recently in the US for a number of conferences, and the reality of two big conferences, both with 15,000 attendees, one in Austin and one in New York, no one talked about price. I mean, the content was, to your point, what are you building? What are you doing? It wasn't, oh my God, my bags have now been materially diminished. It was, here's the product. Does it serve a purpose? They're just boring conversations in that they are building business. So that's where the conversations live. But the reality in rooms is when you read the headline, you tend to respond to the headline. If you're reading the article, you tend to respond to the article. Or if you have a conversation that's not reflected, you make your own way forward. So I spend most of my time in number 2 and number 3, and don't worry so much about the clickable thing. Otherwise, I'd be a troll on the internet the same as everyone else. I'd be responding to every negative headline. So we've all seen it. Bitcoin's been called dead too many times to count. You go, that's okay. But no one calls it sideways. No one says, by the way, in between calling it dead, it went sideways or up. So it's a missing part of the narrative.
Yeah, the reality is Bitcoin's taking a breather while we're rebuilding. Like, that's the reality, but no one wants to put that headline. It's boring.
And the macro position too. I mean, you look at this massive unwinding of the liquidity that governments around the world, you're going to get macro matters. Like when people say, see, we told you Bitcoin's not a store of value. I said, go check out the NASDAQ over the last 6 months. There's such a massive unwinding of liquidity. You can't cherry pick the thing. They go, well, this proves my point. You go, well, okay, here are 15 other points that say the world is struggling with inflation and the unwinding of liquidity. And if you've got some Bitcoin or some crypto, chances are if you feel like you're under pressure financially, you will liquidate that thing. People will have to continue to do those things. So they're not disconnected.
Yeah.
No, you're 100% right there. It's a good segue. You mentioned something that I had a question for you, because you say you've just come back over the last couple of weeks from being in the US for what seemed like, I was following you on social media, on LinkedIn, a whirlwind tour. And you mentioned two, NFT.NYC, which is a big NFT convention, for want of a better term, in New York, and Consensus in Austin, Texas, which is part of, which is run by Coinbase. Is that correct?
Yes, CoinDesk.
CoinDesk, sorry, my apologies. Can you expand on what they were? Because there was quite a contingent of Australian people that went along with you for the. Was it all part of the Blockchain Australia organization? But there were lots of other people, of course, as well. How did that unfold, and what was happening over there?
Sure, it was the opposite. It was a bit of an undelegation as opposed to a delegation. The groups that were going were enormous. So and they were separate groups too. It wasn't one group that sort of bounced across. What we said was, we think there's some value in these events for different reasons. So let's connect the dots and try to get some people who show up there. Normally you go to a conference, you look for the connections, you spend your time trying to make sure you're not sitting by yourself and go to the right things. We acted as a conduit for sort of conversation. So cool. Consensus had 15,000 delegates, I believe, give or take, is what their marketing will tell you. We know that we had a cohort of Australians that was in excess of 100 people, a really significant number of people that were off their own bat going to the US. And that was the one with the sort of the line of sight on. I believe it was north of 150 people. So it was a lot of Australians putting their hands in their own pockets, asking no one for favors, going over there, trying to talk about what their business was. Consensus is a bit of the OG event. You know, it is very broad. It is mature in its sort of content delivery, lots of familiar faces, lots of big businesses that are there. So that's much more a broad-based, builders of community conversation. That was good to see that kind of momentum around there. I mean, it was vibrant. It was also crazy afterwards. The reality is that people were doing what they haven't been able to do for 2 years, which is network. The number of events was extraordinary outside of something in the vicinity of 250 or 300 visible events that were after hours events. That was Consensus. Wow. Importantly for Consensus, it was in Austin, and it's kind of something which we probably should aspire to a little bit. Austin, you could feel the vibrancy in Austin. It's a city that people have moved to because they view it as a place where things will get done. So you get that sense of investment, you get that sense of purpose. There's a natural energy there. So it was nice to be in a city that felt like it was going to make an impact in a tech sense. New York was the monster it always is. NFT NYC, again, 15,000 delegates. These are things that most people, as you pointed out, it's dead, except there were 15,000 people times two within a week and a half.
Exactly.
That was a very different event in that it was too big in some respects. They had something in the vicinity of 1,500 speakers across, I think, 6 live sites. It was impossible to digest. That was almost a generational thing. You saw people who probably lampooned in their own social circles. All you're doing is flipping JPEGs, and it's so silly to pay money for a Bored Ape. And you just, again, watch people who understand what Web3 means. So, you have people who are committing to a future that was the creation of content, the creation of value, the provision of services in a Web3 environment. So that was more Web3 skewed. And what does the future look like? Consensus was a more mature version of what this space is. In between, important for people to note again, this is the connection that says the boring stuff is happening and it matters. I was in Washington for a few days, and if you don't think Australia is relevant on the global stage, it would sort of run counter to the fact that I, along with Caroline Bowler from BTC Markets, met with the Federal Reserve in Washington. And we sat there in a room with 4 members of the Federal Reserve. And I thought that's a great turnout until they said, and by the way, there are 10 more people from the Federal Reserve on the call who are tuning in. It made me proud to think that from an Australian perspective, the bank that matters to the world, that is the Fed Reserve, felt it was appropriate to commit an hour of the time by 14 people to listen into what was happening in Australia. So that's the bit that, again, is not grabbing, but it reflects the fact that they're interested in what we're doing. And likewise, if there's some continuing relationships we can engender, then we're very happy to do it.
Yeah, well done. That's fantastic. Yeah. I want to get Caroline on the podcast. I've tried connecting to her on LinkedIn, but haven't succeeded. So I'll have to do that through you. And Caroline, if you're watching, hello, come on the show.
Persistent. We keep knocking, don't we?
Yeah, because we're clients. So we use BTC Markets. So, Rob and I, we have to get her on the show for that reason alone.
We'll get that done.
We'll get that sorted. And shamefully, we haven't had any females on this podcast, which I've tried to do, but it hasn't happened yet. So anyway, we've got to make that.
Today, mate. The reality is I have an extraordinary list of very impressive females in this space, so I can help you redress that.
Cool. We're going to address that quick, smart.
Just then, you were talking about over at these conferences the Web3 and future of blockchain technology, as opposed to people that are there talking about ape JPEGs. Can we just basically talk about, at the moment, we don't know what Web3 is going to be, but do you have any sort of opinion on or insight into what the next 5 years is going to hold? Because some people say Web3 is going to be the new internet. And how is it going to change the DNS to a new type of internet connection? Like, I can't say it as technologically as I'd like. If you could explain what you think it's going to be.
So I have a sort of an analogous situation in terms of the way things roll out and how people think things roll out. And they're two very different views. Generally, people say, why can't we talk about this thing and make this thing happen in a monolithic way? Here's this thing. Why can't we just tell people and we just carry this forward? Like, last night I was at an event where the question was asked, when does this become a mainstream thing?
Yeah.
Well, when does everyone agree about this thing? Well, likely never. The reality here is mainstream does not mean everyone has to agree. It just needs to reach a tipping point where it becomes a compelling proposition for a subset of people. So that mainstreaming, in many respects, the mainstreaming has happened visibly, maybe not so much as it is invisible. When I'm behind closed doors and talking to traditional financial service businesses as an example, they know this technology will eat at their business and ultimately will materially impact their business and may at some point in time disrupt. So that lens that is this monolithic one, it just doesn't work that way. The analogous situation for me to observe how the Web3 stuff will play out is you'll both remember people were talking about the web was going mobile. For years I was chatting to people about the mobile web and mobile phones. And
that's right. And when the iPhone came out, everyone said websites are dead and we're all going to use apps now.
And that's right. And then we went through that stage where everyone was building an app, and usually they were terrible apps that no one wanted. And the app dream came to an end. And we kept looking at this thing, which was one day it's going to be in mobile and one day it's going to be mobile, until we just went, oh, it's mobile. What happened? Like predicted were terrible. Everyone said it's coming. And then happened. And it was because Google started changing their algorithm in terms of how they rank things. People started optimizing it. So it wasn't the one thing. But when you stood back from it, you went, oh well, somewhere along the line, the trends happened, everything shifted, and we wouldn't for a minute prioritize desktop over mobile. So the Web3 rollout for me is something akin to that. There are some things that are very compelling in the short term. People are incentivized economically to drive those things. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the things that you and I want or anyone wants. It's where are the incentives? And then where are the people who chip away and build at things? So I expect it to be asynchronous in the way it kind of rolls out. And the biggest challenge I have in a lot of the rooms that I'm in is people talk about the better mousetrap, but they underestimate how much time and effort has gone into legacy systems, how many resources supplement those legacy systems. So the notion that you can come in and say, I can do this better, misunderstands or underappreciates the fact that people probably don't want it to be done better at this point in time, and they might. So you really need to, in a fragmented and fractured way, understand what people's context and priorities are. So I expect the things that economically incentivize people will happen in the short term, much more obviously, and then otherwise we'll continue to chip away at things that we view as, and this is what I love about the space, things like social good that can be achieved through Web3 and some of this technology. That's not anything that will happen overnight. That will be, I think, something that people build these foundations that you launch off ultimately. So that's how I think it plays out, which is not in a straight line. We're all terrible predictors what technology will and won't do. So if you guys are better at doing that than me, then good luck to you. But I can tell with hindsight.
No. I have a simplistic view of this in terms of my opinion is that in 10 to 15 years time, the blockchain will be ubiquitous. And it's just going to be a point where people are using it and they don't even know they're using it. Like they're using a system that is blockchain driven or that underpins it. But it's been woven into our everyday lives, pretty much like how the internet is. A lot of people are doing everything there. They're not even thinking about it. I think that point will come. the shape and form of that, I have no idea. The winners and losers and technology that takes foothold, who knows? But that's part of the exciting thing. It's like, I mean, you know, I'm turning 55 in October, and I was around in the early days. So was Rob. He was a bit younger than me, but and I don't know how old you are, Steve, but you say you're looking, you could be a very, very young 30-year-old that's had a hard time in the last couple of years with blockchain, or you could just—
it's the filter.
It's the filter. So you know, it's exciting times. There's lots of stuff happening, and this is where Rob and I, to say we get frustrated, and one of the reasons we do this podcast is to try and help educate people and get experts on like yourself, is to have an open mind. People who poo-poo all this stuff and write it off, I think that's a dangerous attitude to have, because there's so many things that are coming down the pipeline that people aren't aware of, and so many opportunities. So if you just stand there and say, no, this is all crap and it's never going to work and it's all finished, you're doing yourself a huge disservice, for both personally and as a business, in my opinion.
From my perspective, I don't try to change people's minds. The reality of that is it's folly to try to change people's minds. I mean, you think about you know how hard it is to do it, given that you usually have a very short period of time. What I do in the rooms I'm in is I say, here are data points that you may or may not be aware of. Here is a synthesis of that information that you may or may not be aware of. And at the end of all of these sort of conversations, and whether or not they're one-off or multiple, I say to people, ultimately, own your decision. Like, you don't have to do anything. That's my takeaway every time I speak to people is, if in the years to come, I was right, you were right, we were both wrong, we were both right, it doesn't matter. I said, but at least, you know, there was a marker put in the sand at this point in time, which was, here's what we're seeing, this is what it looks like, and here's a guess of where it might go. You can make a decision to ignore that information and go about your business. I spoke at an event a while back where it was a representative, very well regarded, very bright person working for a consulting business, and one of the big consulting businesses. And they made the observation that the industry is dead, and this was now, I think, a year and a half, 2 years ago. They said, the industry's dead, the experiments failed, it's a nothing. And we went backwards and forwards in an environment, had this conversation. And again, from my perspective, it's an argument that's gotten weaker and weaker, because I'm finding when people talk about the space, they have to talk in more generalized terms to make their point. They say blockchain people and crypto people. I said, I don't know who these people are, because we don't travel in a marauding pack. I said, when I say people, lawyers and consultants and builders and startup and government, they're blockchain people. And at the end of the presentation and the conversation, I said, listen, I've looked at your website whilst you were chatting, and it says that there are thousands of people in your own business looking at this. I said, so even within your own business, there are probably a couple of thousand people that disagree. I said, so take the information for what it is, and off you go. And that was the point. I didn't want to embarrass him. I just wanted to say there are alternative views, and they just don't accord with yours. Same, I can live with people having very different views to my own.
Yeah, that's a very, very mature attitude to have, Steve. Rob and I are working on that one.
I find myself tripping myself up all the time on thinking about the future and analyzing it. And I go too far into the future in my own head, because in my dream would be that we turn on the blockchain Web3 internet in 2 years from today, and we switch off the 1995 DNS. We just, overnight, we just, and I know that's impossible. It's not going to happen, but I wish I was like the prime minister of the future internet Web3, because I just say, this is the date we're doing it, and we're turning all the old stuff off. But I know that's not as easy as that.
I think the reality is, as you're driving down this freeway, everyone's trying to flag you down, and we can't help but stop. Usually to sort of go, they must be flagging me down for a purpose, and it slows you down and you go again. I would also like that to happen in an uninterrupted. So the linear good is the same as the linear bad, and if people have good reasons for trying to slow you down. Often it's not that they're not well intentioned. The reality here is that you've got to convince a lot of people. If you think you have to take everybody with you, you know the old line of a rising tide lifts all boats. I always say to people, but you need to have a boat. You need
to be in the boat.
The tide's of no use if you haven't put a boat in the water. I said, so yes, I get that we can all be elevated, but you need a boat to do it.
Yeah, I like that.
A good website for people to go and have a look at, to get an idea of the broad spectrum of different people and organizations involved in this whole space, is the Blockchain Week event that Steve and Blockchain Australia ran back in March, which I watched virtually, which was absolutely mind-blowing and well done. The mammoth task of organizing that just freaks me the hell out. So anyway, if you want to have a look at it and all the recordings of the different speakers, there was hundreds of speakers over 5 days in different parts of the world, all different states in Australia. So blockchainweek.com.au, we'll put the link in the show notes, but it lists all the different speakers and different businesses that they're with. And it's really quite astounding to look at all the representation of different people. Well done, mate, for putting that together. That was a mind blower.
And I think that's code for I was crazy for doing it. I've got to tell you that for me, I loved it. The bit I loved was, and this is not to speak ill of what people generally do. I chose the people to speak. Like, there were 280 speakers. There was no accident that people were there, right? There was no accident. The whole aim for me here is I wanted it to feel like a time capsule of where Australia was and where the world was in March of 2022. And that's why we said it's all free. We didn't ticket any of this stuff. We said all the content's available for you there. And the bit that is important for me, and this is a reflection of this sort of the breadth of the definition that you asked me about at the beginning, it was done in 5 days because thematically there were 5 different days. Day 1 was the mainstream conversation, traditional financial services hosted at the ASIC. Day 2 was an extraordinary day of builders from around the world. It was the people that have built out billion-dollar protocols and Australians who aspire to do this thing. It was deep tech, and it was very not like the Monday. Wednesday was NFTs, and we're at the AFL, we're talking about that side of it and what that ecosystem looked like. Thursday was all regulation, and we talked about the complexity with which we're navigating this. And Fridays were startups and Australia's position in the startup ecosystem. I kind of said, you can gorge at the table here. You can eat every one of these things and have a look, or you can dive in. But it is a reflection that there are an extraordinary number of people working very hard. And I can tell you the 280-ish people that I invited to speak was such a small section of the people who demanded to speak. It was terrible that I didn't get anywhere near. It was literally a fraction. It was 10% of. I had so many people who deserved to speak, and even 5 days nonstop, multi-stream. We ran most of these things as 2 streams running concurrently. So that was the only way we could surface all these people. It was the tip of the iceberg. So that's when I defend the industry broadly. I go, point me to those people on that lineup who don't deserve credit for the thing that they're trying to do, or effort or recognition. So that's the legacy that is that bit there. I just point them back to that. So I appreciate you pointing them back to that as well.
Yeah, no, it was. I'm still watching it. I haven't got to the end of it. So I don't know how anyone would have actually consumed it all in a week. That would have been you wouldn't have slept. But no, it's fantastic. So yeah, blockchainweek.com.au, check it out. It's an amazing, as a landmark session or production of what was happening in 2022 in March globally, not just in Australia, of course. So that's fantastic. Rob, you got some other stuff on your whiteboard
Let's
there.
literally talk about. We've touched on Blockchain Australia, but maybe Steve can let us know, what is Blockchain Australia? What's its objective?
Sure. So Blockchain Australia is a membership organisation. We're an industry body. We describe ourselves as the peak industry body with respect to this subject matter. Unusual in its breadth, because normally they are focused on particular sort of niches. The challenge of the space reflected in the membership base is at one end we have startups at ideation stage and startups that need high touch assistance whose stories we're trying to get in market, including trying to make them better businesses and ultimately help them along their path that is funding and sort of growing and expanding. We have SMEs and we have professional service businesses, the likes of KPMG, EY, PwC, all members of the association. So, and a lot of lawyers, a lot of law firms that sort of live in there as well. Builders, not enough builders, and this is the challenge of the ecosystem for us is talent and the challenge that is Australia versus every other country as well. Trying to engender interest in building out of Australia is a tricky thing because it's a massive talent shortage. And at the other end is the very traditional world that is financial service businesses. We have the likes of Macquarie Bank and some other banks as members. We have payments providers, Zepto, Maneuver, a lot of businesses that are very familiar and traditional. So we run the gamut of businesses in this space. Again, sort of a reflection of lots of people trying to grow ecosystems in lots of directions. So true to the ethos, distributed, decentralized, and moving towards a sort of improvement in lots of different ways, which hopefully culminate to an ecosystem that is mature enough for many more people to take seriously.
And so anyone out there who wants to keep up to date with what's happening with you guys in blockchain in Australia, they should become a member.
Oh, that's nice of you to say. I mean, they should look at becoming a member. The good news has been that there's value delivery, I think. I mean, the reality of these membership things, I say no to more members than I say yes, and I say that not in a bad way. The truth is sometimes people try to lean in on relationships and reputation. And again, I think trust is an incredibly difficult thing to build in this ecosystem. So as an industry, I am protective of the trust and the effort that people put in. So it's rarely that I say no for bad reasons. We kind of say you need to give more consideration to the implications of the thing you're doing. So membership by application. So we go through that process and vet businesses and do due diligence rather than saying come one, come all, and we'll clip the ticket on the way through. So we think it's a very considered way to sort of do this, given how hard everyone's worked over the last few years to grow this ecosystem's integrity.
Great.
Yeah, that's a different approach. So normally organisations are just, as I say, taking anyone and everyone they can get on. But based on what you're saying, just even with the speakers wanting to get on and talk at the events and various things, there's so many people in this space. I think that's the thing that people don't realise out there in the sort of normal world, quotation marks, if you're listening to this podcast, not watching it. They don't realize all of this groundswell of stuff that's happening. And you say, if you were to dive deep, I'm looking at this list of speakers again from Blockchain Week. If you were to dive deep just on each one of them, like Yats Yu from Animoca, I mean, far out. That's a story and a half. For those who don't know, Animoca brands, they're big in the blockchain gaming space. They've just teamed up with B Media, who is a Perth-based marketing and agency. There's all sorts of stuff going on. There's a lot of, and you're talking about getting talent and the challenges with keeping up with the demand. And that's the one thing I've seen, because I've run a marketing agency for 20 years. A lot of the Web 1, Web 2 talent people are now migrating across to upskilling themselves to work in the Web 3 space, because it's a lot of complementary coding skills and other things like that. But there just doesn't seem, the demand seems to be outstripping the supply. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, and think back on the point with the Yats. So Yat's a great story. It's also a terrible story for us, because Yat was it was an ASX listed business, and for a variety of reasons decided that the opportunities were better and the business was better served leaving Australia. And now you look at it, and even in the crypto winter, I think recently valued as a $5 billion business. He's an extraordinary person to listen to in terms of the breadth of understanding he has of this space. But it's an example, again, of, for whatever reason, he left the jurisdiction. He'll speak about it. He doesn't speak ill of Australia, but there was more opportunity offshore. That was one thing. The other bit that's sort of lost on people, and this is the challenge, when you look at this space, and people talk about things like the Great Resignation, and they talk about people needing purposeful work. The reality of this ecosystem as a whole is you tend to get more opportunities to align your aims and goals with the role that you're doing. People are investing themselves in roles. They're also investing themselves in these protocols. They commit to things. It's personal and professional investment. So they're aligning incentives in a way that you don't normally get an opportunity to do. If you go work for a traditional business, a law firm, a consulting business, they say, build these units. Your wage will be determined by whether you meet this target. And as you go, we'll just move you up the ladder. Versus saying to a 25-year-old, here's this thing we're building from scratch. You can, by the way, buy some tokenized value or participate in this thing, or you might get distribution, and you'll be paid, and we want to do some social good. Again, that's a compelling thing to tell a 25-year-old and 35 and 45 and 55. And there's been a failure to grasp outside of this ecosystem how much it matters to people to do things that they think might make a difference. It might be naive to think we can all make differences, but they look at it and say, this is purposeful, and it more closely aligns with what I'm doing. And this ecosystem is attractive to people for that very reason. Remote work is not shunned. Remote work is the norm in this ecosystem, because people who are building out these businesses, on the talent shortage, they say, we'll take talent wherever it is. If that talent is available, we'll take it. So that's something which is not yet appreciated across the country and also across the industries.
No, that's a point. Good point. It is a funny thing because I've been working from home for 20 years, and that was always my design when I started this business. I never wanted an office. I didn't want staff in an office. It was just like, this was not how it was going to be. So when the whole COVID thing happened and then everyone was working from home, I'm going, the world is caught up. But it's interesting, that whole section of the hybrid office now is there's a lot of companies who seem to be saying staff can just work from home now. They don't have to ever come back to the office. They're starting to change their tune a bit, like Elon Musk is saying with various things. I'm going, well, hang on, now you can't have it and say they can do this and then take it away from them. Well, they can, I suppose, because they're the business that owns it. But it's interesting. It's just, the story for a 25-year-old now is very different for the story from a 25-year-old from 30 years ago.
There's just more choice. If a 25-year-old wants to work in an office and feel the energy of that environment, great. But if they want to sit in a room or in their own house and do it, they can still perform and add value to a company.
It's funny, the lens. I mean, I think, the way people are viewing these things. When I did my articles as a lawyer, I was paid literally nothing. It was funny that I was told at the time, unsurprisingly, by a lawyer who at that stage was close to retirement, you should consider yourself lucky that you're being given this opportunity. I said, I'm not being paid to work 70 hours a week. I go, I'm lucky, but the reality here is I'm also not being paid to work. Whereas you say that to a 25-year-old now, and people will very quickly lament what these generations that don't have a work ethic. The reality here is don't apply your lens to what the world looks like as a 25-year-old. It's an entirely different thing for people to do. And on the social and digital side, I'm on TikTok. I love TikTok. It is an incredible app in terms of how hyper connected all these things are. But you say to the average 50-year-old, and they go, it's just rubbish. It's what the kids are on. I go, yeah, but the kids are on becomes what the adults are on, by the way. You go, we just keep cycling around this thing. You've got to understand what technology means to different demographics. Otherwise, creating fit for purpose outcomes and opportunities hard to do.
All good points.
You got to stay young in here as well as in here. But this is, and being a 55-year-old almost myself, I talk to people my age who are still struggling to use a keyboard or just to log on to their normal computer, and I'm going, it is. You've really got to be open-minded and allow yourself to adapt. And not everyone's technologically minded. I don't consider, I'm not a coder. I'm not really who I would classify as technical, but I like to think of myself as being open-minded to not dismiss things that are in front of me.
And you're opting in to keep up with how things are going.
Opting in to keep up.
You don't have to be a rocket scientist. You just have to keep involved if you want to be involved.
It's funny, guys. The reality is often people don't realize they are keeping up with it. You ask someone, are you on TikTok? They say, no, of course not. That's for kids. You say, you're on Instagram? They say, yes. They go, you're watching Reels? And they go, yeah. I go, that's TikTok.
That's TikTok, yeah.
And I wouldn't be on TikTok. It's ridiculous. But I love those videos on Instagram. You go, same thing. It's a cheap knockoff of the thing that's working over there. So it's funny. Not in my backyard, wouldn't touch it. And they do exactly the same thing. So that's an experience that's new to me.
Funnily enough, my 22-year-old daughter said she was never going to go on TikTok. It's a load of crap. I was on it before she was. And now she's using it. So it's really good. I mean, it was pretty, back when I first got on, back in the day, it was just lots of people doing weird dances. And that's when I got on. And I was, Gary Vaynerchuk was saying, you got to get on TikTok. So I was like, I'll get on TikTok. Anyway, we digress. So anything else before we finish up with the wonderful Steve Vallas?
Anyone that's cottoned on to watching our show, because we've had some amazing guests on lately, including Steve today. Anyone who watches our show and is still thinking that like crypto and blockchain's like not going to work out, apart from Steve mentioning before when he was in the US, you got to meet with the Federal Reserve, which is like pretty up. It's pretty much up there. I can't even believe that happened. That's amazing. I didn't know we were at that stage. Let's talk about Steve. You're a part of DFAP, Digital Finance Advisory Panel, advising like ASIC on fintech and regtech related matters, and also you're the vice chair of ASEAN Blockchain Consortium. Can we find out what's happening in those two areas?
Yeah, it's the same thing with both in many respects. I was at an event, as I said last night, and the advice I gave the audience is understand other people's contexts more. And people don't do that enough. With DFAP and the ASEAN Blockchain Consortium, and any of these things, effectively what we're doing is I'm adding value by telling them the things that impact what they're doing. So DFAP is part of ASIC's industry engagement. They speak to a variety of people who have experience within industry or hear the voice of industry, bring us together and say, can you help inform better policy? That's not just saying, here's what's happening in the industry. It's also saying, here's what's happening in the industry, and here's what we understand about how it intersects with what you're doing. And that last bit is the bit that people tend not to get to, because you kind of figure, well, surely people get it. But unless you understand that ASIC is a good example, ASIC are there to stop bad actors. You know, they are ultimately the police when it comes to bad actors in financial services or otherwise. So they're not there to welcome anyone who might disrupt technology. That's not their role. So once you recognize that's not their role, you stop going to them saying, but we've got a better mousetrap. They go, we're not in the business of mousetraps. You know, that's the reality of what they are. So with DFAP, as a sort of industry representative, I'll go in and say, here's what's happening in the industry. And I'm happy to talk about things that are good and bad. And again, that bit that says, let's not pretend everything is always dandy. But what I do say to them is, and this is an important message to ASIC and outside of ASIC, is that we turn the lights on in all the rooms we're in. I mean, there are no dark corners here. Australia is not the place to decide that you want to live in a libertarian utopia. Pick a country that you think is that country. Australia's not it. The reality here is you operate within a certain set of parameters. And if you don't like it, you shouldn't be here to do that. So, you know, that's a message that we go back and advise into government and say, sure, if people want to do this, is it a product that warrants or requires licensing? And if the answer is yes, then we ask the next question. So it's kind of saying, how does this fit into the job that you're there to do? And that's what the DFAP kind of relationships are. In the Asia Pacific side, we all look over the fence and admire the green grass that is in everyone else's backyards. And I can tell you that the advantage for me of having a global view of this is I recognize that all of us have concrete we've painted green. There's no grass in any of these backyards, but we like from a distance to identify how nice it looks. We all have the same challenges. We're all having the challenges which are convincing regulators or maturing enough to the point we're going to do this, or understanding the implication or this technology might be outside of our own borders. There's shared common and purposes. No one is having these unique conversations. We're all just trying to find our way through.
So with the ASEAN Blockchain Consortium, you're finding in Singapore and Indonesia, they're at the same kind of stage as us.
Yeah, different challenges. The reality, some regulatory bodies are more open to talking about it. Doesn't mean they're doing more. They're more open to talking about it, and others are more constrained. Different ways to sort of do things. When it comes to the industries, sometimes Australia looks like a better place to open a business, and sometimes Singapore, as an example, looks like a better place to do that. The connectivity of this conversation, and this is the position I take into state governments are a very good example. State governments in Australia are important in the purposes they serve. They're not that important when it comes to this technology, because the line that separates Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland, as an example, doesn't matter to technology that is built on code and makes it across the world in an instant. So I keep saying, I know the squiggly line's important if I'm worried about what my driver's license is or where I own a property, but it doesn't matter for me facilitating a payment infrastructure outcome that goes to the other side of the world. So it's kind of getting people to sense sometimes geography matters and other times it doesn't. The Asia Pacific has a tendency to move faster than us when it comes to the rollout of technology. You know, Australia has some very natural advantages that affords us an opportunity to take a bit more time. You know, I think generally we categorize ourselves as fast followers rather than, you know, the people that move quick and break things. We can do that. We can take a little bit of time. A lot of the APAC countries feel the need in order to make sure that they can elevate their own position. They'll just charge at it. So there's a lot to learn from economies that can say, listen, we're not as worried about the implications. Let's move forward a bit faster. That sort of, for me, is the framing of where we sit in this sort of global landscape. And the hope for me, having watched Australia be described in a lot of rooms, language that wasn't used, I can tell you 5 years ago and 2 years ago, that's being used in the last 6 months, related to also Blockchain Week. We're being described as strategically important. Now, that matters because it says we're important. People are not thinking Australia doesn't matter. That use of language, without it being communicated, people are using the same language in different rooms where they're saying, we think it's strategically important, which means they want to be here because we are sending the right signals about Australia being a destination for investment and as a base potentially to launch into APAC as opposed to being a branch office for other businesses. So I listen to those cues and the cues are strong. It would be a shame if we drifted away from that kind of conversation back into no one mentioned Australia because it didn't feel like it was particularly relevant.
No. Well said. Good points.
And what about the National Blockchain Roadmap Steering Committee? There's some big names and members of that committee, including yourself there, Steve. You've got people from the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Stock Exchange. You've got CSIRO, you've got some law firms on there, and the digital officer from the Digital Transformation Agency. What's that all about?
Well, everyone's got an acronym, obviously. So you don't get an acronym.
Yeah.
It's important. The really important part of the Department of Industry is they gave this subject matter a home in Australia at first. And the reality is, when I talk to people generally within businesses, this happens at a granular level within businesses and also at a state and a federal level, is who owns the conversation? And if the answer is no one, then you can't have a conversation. You know, if there's no door to walk through, you don't walk through the door. The Department of Industry a couple of years ago identified a roadmap, which was basically a wireframe of where we should go, and then fleshed out at the time subject matter that we should give consideration to. It was an extraordinarily important first step. And people at the time often, and this is again with the benefit of hindsight for most, when it happened, a lot of people said it's no good. And the main reason they said it was no good was they said, well, there's no money allocated to it. The smartest thing they ever did was not allocate money to it, because it would have been spent and we probably wouldn't have got the outcome that the money was allocated for. Instead, they said, here is a roadmap. That's what's in the title. Let's talk about subject matter. And they at first instance spoke to and continue to speak to issues that don't get mired in the cryptocurrency side. They spoke and speak to credentials and credentialing, you know, basically often in the education sector as a use case. And we talked about RegTech, you know, process improvement and sort of efficiency gains. That resonates with people. We've also spoken about cybersecurity as a very important subject matter, and supply chains, because supply chains have failed the world in the last couple of years, and it's a really important subject matter. Those four things people can attach to without the, oh my God, cryptocurrency is a scam. You go, are supply chains an issue? Well, they are for all of us, particularly right now. Is cybersecurity an issue? Yes, it is. So that was the Department of Industry saying, here's a conversation around specific subject matter that might be of interest to you. So that's what purpose that roadmap has been serving and continues to serve. So I'm still engaged as of yesterday. I spoke to a bunch of stakeholders to talk about the implications of the cybersecurity conversation that we've had over the last year or two. So those things continue to make their way through government departments across the country.
Amazing.
Wow, well, we're so glad you came on today, Steve. It's clear that you're doing important work, really, for this beginning stages of blockchain technology in Australia across all the stuff we've been talking about today. And I hope a lot of people watch this who think crypto and blockchain's like not really happening, because from everything we've talked today, you're talking to governments and big departments and the Federal Reserve about Australia's spot in the future of blockchain technology and infrastructure. This sounds to me like it's just getting started, and so people shouldn't be seeing the negative, and hopefully they can just block out all this negative media, you know, the Bitcoin's down this week garbage, and just concentrate on the positives in the future, and how can they be involved, and where do they want to see themselves being involved in blockchain technology in the next few years.
It's absolutely, I've never been more optimistic, simply because the quality of the conversations, to your point, is extraordinary. I mean, it is off the chart compared to what the conversations were.
And I bet you they're excited when they talk about this with you.
There is a level of, it's funny that you wouldn't think, but you talk to people who day in, day out have to deal with the same, you know, square peg, square hole, and you talk about what this looks like, and you can see the wheels turning. You see them saying, well, hold on a second, that might influence this thing, or that might connect here. That's a satisfying thing to do. And in rooms, you know, the reality of a few years back, I could tell that when I was doing presentations to fill rooms, you know, I was lucky to find the one person who was sitting in there doing this and nodding along. And now it feels like I see lots of heads. You go, it's not the majority. And that's the bit where people, again, get lost. But I see multiple people where you go, yeah, that resonates with them, and they understand what this means as a millennial, and they understand what this means as a financial service institution, or what this might mean as a startup. You're just watching people that go, okay, this might help this process, which is why the over-egging, you know, of capability or outcomes, and supply chains are a good one. You know, you go back a couple of years and people said this technology will fix supply chains. Here's what we know about supply chains. They're a mess. You can't fix supply chains. You can fix parts of supply chains. So it's kind of saying, focus on the thing where you can say, listen, we can make this part of the process better, and convince people there and then carry them forward. But the conversations are extraordinary. And the final takeaway for people to understand is we sit in rooms and we say, how can we change people's mind about this, or what can we do? The reality is, when I have issues that I want to address with my family, the first thing I do is have a conversation with them behind closed doors before I jump into the public domain and tell everyone. What you see as an output tends to be a follow-on of what's happening behind closed doors. And I can tell people with confidence that the behind closed doors versions here, where people are feeling their way through, it's extraordinarily interesting and absolutely next level compared to what's happened in recent years.
Yeah, wow.
Awesome.
Exciting.
So look, I would say to anyone who's in Australia or outside of Australia who would like to meet this amazing man who obviously doesn't sleep, come and meet Steve at the Australian Crypto Convention in September on the 17th and 18th. Rob and I will be there. That may be a reason not to go, but Rob and I will be there. And we've met Steve in person, so we're going from virtual to physical. So that'd be nice to meet Steve, and you can come along yourself and meet him. It'd be a fantastic event. It's already expanding, and so we had David Haslop on the last episode talking about it and how it's gone from he had just one room booked in the convention center and now just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I think he's got the whole place booked now. So yeah, it's exciting times. Come along to the Gold Coast. It's a beautiful spot. You can go to the beach in between sessions, and where all the action happens, as Steve said, is in the after parties, the after sessions, the having dinners, going to the pub,
getting excited about this new industry. And it's still called, we can still classify it as new.
Oh, absolutely. It's as new as the internet was in 1995, in my opinion. So look, we really appreciate it, Steve. Thanks for coming on. And I know you're a busy man, so we really enjoyed having you on the podcast. We hope to have you back on sometime in the future. We will see you on the Gold Coast. And for those watching or listening, if you haven't subscribed already, do us a favor, hit the like button. If you're on YouTube, subscribe. We appreciate it. Get more people following along and learning about all of this lovely Web3 stuff. All right. Thank you, gentlemen. Thanks, Rob. And we'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks for the opportunity, gents. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.